Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to our weekly review of situation in Palestine and the region. I am, as always, joined by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani, to unpack the biggest stories. Mouin, thank you for joining me again.
Thank you for having me, Nasim. It's always a pleasure.
This week, I want to begin with the first Trump's trip to the region. He landed in Saudi Arabia today, Tuesday, 13th May. This is when we are recording the show. So much of what we say may be taken over by events over the next couple of days. And then we'll move to Gaza and the wider region. So let's begin then with Trump's trip to first Saudi Arabia. Then he will be going to, I think, Qatar and then the UAE, and avoid Israel or snubbing Israel, as some may want to say. And I'm interested to see if the Saudis will commit to the 1 trillion investment Trump is seeking. And also, I want to see if they do agree to some kind of a nuclear deal and offering US security guarantees. So these are things I'm looking out for. What are you looking out for over the next 3 or 4 days, Moin, as Trump tours the region?
Well, various things, but as you mentioned, all the available reports indicate that Trump is snubbing Israel, which is quite different than during his first term, but that he may be going to Turkey as well at the end of his trip to convene negotiations between the Russian and Ukrainian leaders. As far as Trump's visit, and I think in contrast to much of his Middle East diplomacy during his first term, this is really all about bilateral relations between the United States and the countries he's visiting involved. So in Saudi Arabia, as you mentioned, they're signing a whole series of agreements that concern increased Saudi investments in the United States, cooperation on nuclear energy, presumably cooperation with respect to reducing the oil price, cooperation on artificial intelligence, and the rest of it. And we haven't heard a peep about Saudi-Israeli normalization, which appears to confirm reporting, I believe, in Middle East Eye last week, that the Saudi foreign minister had visited Washington and made very clear to his hosts that the Saudi rulers didn't want to have any discussion of normalization with Israel, either in public or in private. A complete sea change from Trump's first term. Regional issues are, however, also on the agenda, and these concern first and foremost Iran, where again, in sharp contrast to Trump's first term, Israel is still agitating for war against Iran, while the United States is now negotiating with Iran to seek to produce a new nuclear agreement. And crucially, those states that were most hostile to Iran during Trump's first term, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, are now actively encouraging US Iranian diplomacy. I presume that the situation in Yemen will also be on the agenda because the recent US campaign against Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen, threatened to derail the long-term ceasefire that had been reached between the Houthis on the one hand and the Saudis and the Emiratis on the other. And I presume that in Qatar, there will be discussions about a new agreement concerning the Gaza Strip, but we'll get to that later.
What have you made of the 400 million plane that was gifted to Trump? I mean, a lot of people will look at that and say, this is again Qatar trying to buy its way into, well, exerting influence on US foreign policy. And what do you make of that?
Well, breaking news, some states have been known to seek influence in other states. The sole exception, of course, is Israel, which has never, throughout its entire history, sought to gain or exert influence of any sort in any country, and particularly not in the United States. The record is there
Mm.
for all to see. Of course, this is about influence. Look, the issue is that in the US political system, its politicians are for sale and every few years are auctioned off to the highest bidder. And in this case, the Zionist lobby in the United States thought it had purchased Trump with the $100 million+ that Miriam Adelson gave to Trump. But then, to their shock and surprise, there's been a second auction, and the Gulf states managed to deploy many more resources than Adelson and her colleagues were able to raise. And this is very much about, again, bilateral relations, of seeking to strengthen the relationships between these particular states and the United States. And of course, the United States is the most powerful country in the world, or at least still is. We don't know for how much longer. And every state is trying to exert influence over U.S. policy, first and foremost regarding their bilateral relations, and secondly, with respect to regional affairs in which these states have a direct stake. Now, as far as this plane is concerned, I'm hearing different things. I mean, there's one version that it's effectively a $400 million bribe because this 747 is being gifted personally to Donald Trump, who will continue to use it after he leaves office as his kind of private jet. And then there's another version, which may well be the more accurate one, which is that Qatar is in fact selling this plane to the US Department of Defense, which will be using it as the US presidential airplane until the two new planes that have been ordered by the White House and which are very far behind schedule are ready towards the end of this decade. But certainly, as your question implies, the appearance is not one of extraordinary propriety, and I think to the extent that these assessments are made, I think they reflect much more poorly on the United States and the White House and Donald Trump than they do on those seeking to exert or buy influence. But as anyone who knows anything about the United States will tell you, that's how their political system operates. Its politicians are for sale and are regularly auctioned off to the highest bidder.
Yeah. Trump is just saying yes to everybody and not just not just the Israelis. That's what it seems like. And what have you made of the alleged rift between Netanyahu and Trump? I mean, a lot has been made of that. I mean, the way I look at this is that Trump is there for business, and Israel really cannot provide anything in the way of business at the moment. So he seems to be snubbing Netanyahu. I can imagine a conversation where, what can you gift me, Netanyahu? And he'll say, and there's nothing Israel can give to Trump at the moment. And given that's the case, why should he go? Even Hamas, if you think about the hostage or soldier, American Israeli soldier they released him as a gesture of goodwill to towards Trump. So I think there's a sense that Trump recognizes or appreciates people gifting him things on symbolically doing things on his behalf. And I think Israel at the moment is not in any position to offer anything. That said, I think we can make too much of this so-called disagreement. Deep down, America and Israel are still deeply aligned, and this is probably just media talk. I mean, how have you seen this so-called rift between Trump and Netanyahu?
Well, I agree with you that rift may be too strong a term at this stage, and there's clearly a lot going on behind the scenes that we're unaware of. But at the same time, these constant proclamations, particularly from Israel's officials and apologists, suggesting that relations are better than ever, quite clearly demonstrate that something, and perhaps something serious, is amiss. Getting to the first part of your question, yes, there's no competition. I mean, if you look at the agreements that were initialed in Riyadh this morning, Riyadh is pledging to buy $100 billion in U.S. arms, to invest hundreds of billions of dollars in the U.S., to regulate the oil price that better suits U.S. consumers, and so on. And by contrast, what can Israel offer? To buy a few $1 billion worth of weapons that it's been getting free all these years. That's kind of the extent of it. If you look at these relationships in primarily financial terms, and what the various parties have to offer. Again, in response to your question, we have to understand the changed environment in the Middle East, in the United States, in the Republican Party, and also with respect to Donald Trump in comparison to his first term. In the Middle East, this U.S.-Israeli Arab alignment on a common agenda really no longer exists, or at least not nearly to the extent that it existed during Trump's first term. Um, Normalization and regime change in Iran are no longer the headlines of U.S. policy, and I think a key turning point were the recent revelations that Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, had been scheming behind Trump's back with the former U.S. National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, to seek to draw the U.S. directly into an Israeli war against Iran. And I think this really rubbed Trump the wrong way, because it sought essentially to derail one of his signature policy initiatives during his first year in office. And of course, there's been a sea change in U.S. public opinion towards Israel during the past year and a half. And I think Israel's problem is, if you look at the Democratic Party in the U.S., it functions more or less as a political party. In other words, you can bribe its or purchase its politicians when they get out of line. You can fund a challenger to unseat them during the primary, and so on, and that works reasonably well. Well, the Republican Party has effectively become a personality cult, much more than it is a political party. And what that means is that its officials are much more fearful of challenging the Trump personality cult than they are fearful of challenging Israel and its lobby. And if they're forced to make a choice between the personality cult and the favorite foreign state, 9 out of 10 times they'll choose for Trump in order to save their skin and keep their jobs. And we see this, for example, with Mike Huckabee, who is far and away one of the most fanatic politicians on the entire planet when it comes to slavish devotion to Israel. I mean, he's one of these people who thinks this is all part of biblical prophecy, and end times is coming, and rapture is coming, and he's going to end straight into God's lap or something as a result. And he's now giving statements saying, the United States doesn't need Israel's permission to reach a ceasefire agreement with Ansar Allah, the Houthis in Yemen. So Israel, I think, has severely miscalculated its relations, not so much with the United States as with this administration. And it's now experiencing buyer's remorse. I mean, we've discussed this previously, but Israel and its lobby went all in for Trump. They did everything within their power to help ensure that Trump was elected. And now that they have him, and he's proven to be much less of a loyal ally than was Joe Biden, they're experiencing buyer's remorse. Now, Will this become a crisis? I think it's too early to say. But clearly, if you look at it from the perspective of Israel's government, it already is a crisis because there's also another element here, which is that Israel has for decades traded on the perception that the road to Washington goes through Tel Aviv. In other words, if you want anything from the United States, you have to make nice with Israel because Israel has the capacity, primarily through its minions in Congress, to either make things happen for you or to ensure that things don't happen for you. And so, this perception of a rift between the US and Israel is extremely damaging to Israel's international relations because it can no longer go, to some head of state in Africa or Asia and basically say, you need to do what we want so that we can ensure that the US government does what you want. Because the headlines are all about a crisis between the U.S. president and the Israeli prime minister, and this is all now coming to a head also with differences about what Israel should and should not be doing with respect to the Gaza Strip.
Yeah, and all the polls indicate that Trump is actually pushing on an open door. There's so much support. I mean, the latest polls show that 68% of Americans support a peace treaty, some kind of a negotiation with Iran, not bombing of Iran, which is what the Israelis want, and genocide in Gaza is generally overwhelmingly opposed in the U.S. polls. So, and support for Israel is diminishing. So there's more room for Trump, not just for Trump, any American politician, should they choose to, use that space and garner support for their electoral campaigns or for their foreign policy if they wish to do so and bypass the donors. Trump seems to be willing to bypass his donors and then reach out to the American population who more and more, as I said, are becoming pro-Palestinian. So that said, I mean, I guess, is this the nightmare scenario for Israel and now Benjamin Netanyahu in particular? I mean, the US is making deals with the Houthis, with Saudi Arabia without normalization as a kind of a demand, and also decoupling US interests from Israel's interests, and the hostage release of the American Israeli hostage, who was actually a soldier, I should say, not a hostage. He was a
Prisoner of
soldier.
war.
So that again emphasizes the fact that there is a decoupling of US interest from Israel's interest. And is this the nightmare scenario for Israel and Netanyahu in the long term? And also given how much Israel is seen as a pariah in the US, which we'll get to later on when we speak about a columnist who describes Israel as becoming a pariah state later on.
Yes, I mean, I certainly wouldn't exaggerate its impact as of today, but it's a trajectory that has alarm bells ringing throughout the Israeli leadership. And I mean, if you look at U.S. public opinion, the conventional wisdom or U.S. public opinion generally embraced the idea that Israel is the best thing that ever happened to the United States in the Middle East. You look at that same public opinion today, and it increasingly sees Israel as a burden on U.S. policy in the Middle East. It's seeking to drag the U.S. into war against Iran. The U.S. has had to fight this costly campaign in Yemen, basically to make uh, Gaza Strip safe for Israeli genocide, and so on. And so Israel, the last bastion of global public opinion that stood foursquare behind Israel was the United States. And that's beginning to very significantly fray. And more concerning for Israel should be that Israel's leadership since the 1980s, but particularly during the last 10, 15 years, has worked to make Israel a partisan issue within the US political system. In other words, rather than engaging in the traditional policy of making support for Israel a bipartisan US political priority. It has increasingly hitched its wagon not only to the Republican Party, but to the more extreme elements of the Republican Party. And it is today precisely those elements who are beginning to either turn against Israel or losing interest in supporting anything and everything that Israel does. So it's certainly a brewing crisis. You could make the argument that this growing distance between Trump and Netanyahu is a symptom of that. But I believe that in the years to come, if Israel does not take urgent measures to seek to repair its image in the United States and seek to repair its relations with the United States, it could indeed become a significant crisis.
Let's turn to Gaza now. And I mentioned the release of the American-Israeli soldier, Eden Alexander. and I guess that again further confirms that if Netanyahu prioritized the release of hostages, he could have also done so, but he prefers to continue the genocidal war, the war of extermination, over the release of the hostages. And Hamas has come out numerous times and said that they are willing to release all the hostages in exchange for permanent ceasefire and the withdrawal of Israeli troops. So, isn't is that how you also see the fact that Trump managed to secure the release of the American-Israeli hostages? That Hamas is willing, and the only thing that is in the way of the release of the hostages is Netanyahu's insistence that he has prioritized the decimation and the destruction and the genocide of Gaza above the lives of the hostages that are kept by Hamas.
Well, I think this development is significant on multiple levels. If I can just take a step backwards and recall how we got here. In January, shortly before Trump's inauguration, his envoy, and effectively the person who's functioning as a Secretary of State, Steve Witkoff, um, basically forced Netanyahu to accept the ceasefire agreement that Biden never really showed any interest in forcing down Netanyahu's throat. Hamas had already accepted it. The ceasefire commenced on 19 January, and then in February, March, Witkoff effectively double-crossed Hamas and sought to change the terms of the agreement after Israel and Hamas had already agreed terms and had already begun implementing it. And Hamas refused. And when Hamas refused to go along with this revised agreement, the United States gave Israel the green light to resume its genocidal military campaign on an intensified scale and to launch the most severe siege of the Gaza Strip that we have yet seen. Um, Now, what has happened in the past few weeks is that Hamas has reached out directly to the United States through various intermediaries, and presumably very strongly encouraged, quote unquote, to do so by Qatar and the other states that Trump is visiting. And it offered to release this Israeli active duty soldier who it captured on the 7th of October 2023, who's also a dual US citizen. It offered to release him without anything in return. And this, I think, given that Hamas has constantly insisted that captives will only be released as part of an agreement and in exchange for other things, it raises some questions. So, as I try to understand Hamas's motivations, well, first of all, I think it is seeking to show goodwill towards Trump in the hope that giving him an achievement during his visit to the Arab world may lead to some changes in the US approach towards how to deal with the Gaza Strip. Second of all, demonstrating that captives can be released not only through diplomacy, but in this case through diplomacy that completely excludes Israel. Israel was not involved in this at all and was informed about it by the United States after the agreement had been concluded. I think Hamas is hoping that this will generate further domestic political pressure on the Israeli government to reach an agreement. And the key question now is, will the January agreement, perhaps in some modified form, be put back on the rails, or will the United States permit Israel to resume and even intensify its genocidal military campaign in the Gaza Strip once Trump leaves the region? Israel has said that if no agreement is reached before Trump leaves, it will intensify its campaign and seek to expel the population of the Gaza Strip. What I think we need to understand is it's an American decision, not an Israeli decision. And judging by what Israel does next, we will know what that American decision has been.
Yeah, and I want to get into our next story about the famine in Gaza. The World Food Programme has issued a startling report about the extent of the famine. It's actually stage 5, which is the worst and the highest stage one could get in classification of famines. As many as 470,000 people in Gaza are facing catastrophic hunger. And of course, we should add that, this is really all by design. If you read and listen to the statements of Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli officials, which I will get to later on in some of the other stories we cover, this is all intended to make life unbearable for the Palestinians, so they flee or ethnically cleanse the region. This is all by design. And can you, I guess, provide some flesh into the report by the World Food Programme, the extent of the famine? There's been a lot of coverage about that. I saw an article in the Financial Times where they are describing how Palestinians have been resorted to eating horses and tortoise and other animals as well. It's quite horrific images that comes to your mind.
Mm.
So do you want to just, give us
Yeah.
some details about the extent of that famine?
Yeah, I unfortunately don't have detailed figures available from that report, but my understanding is that it's a fairly rare report, and that the numbers in it are not only alarming but frankly shocking. It explains the percentage of people that are already in severe nutritional stress. It's talking about the impact that this is going to have, even if the situation begins to improve today. And it makes quite horrific projections about what can be expected in the coming months. I believe it's something like 93% of the Gaza Strip, the population, Palestinian population, will be in this most alarming phase of hunger. And I unfortunately don't have the precise numbers with
Well, I
me.
mean, I mean, 470,000 people are facing
That's
catastrophic hunger. I
today.
get
Yeah.
that's yeah. So
Yeah.
I assume that's
Uh,
that's the highest stage of famine you could get. These are the
yeah.
people who are in the imminent facing, I guess, death
Yes.
very soon if they are not
Yeah.
provided with nourishment.
Yes, and children, particularly those with underlying conditions, are already starving to death. And what's somewhat bizarre about this entire development is Israel is telling us word for word exactly what its policy is and why it's implementing this policy and the objectives of this policy. Then we have reports like the one we're discussing and horrific images coming out of the Gaza Strip, which demonstrate that Israel's objectives, as Israel has explained them, are being achieved. But then at the same time, you have Israel flunkies and apologists all over the media and social media and so on, claiming that this is all fake and a fantasy, and that none of this is happening, while also celebrating that it's being implemented. I mean, it's a kind of surreal, Kafkaesque propaganda campaign, which is, yes, Israel may have said this, but none of this is really happening. And then they find a person who was overweight. Um, First a whole slew of body shaming and all the rest of it, and then use this as somehow proof, that no one is experiencing hunger, malnutrition, starvation, or famine in the Gaza Strip. It's really, you know, disgusting at a level that is really difficult to fathom. I mean, the most prominent example, of course, is this um, truly monstrous collection of vile and thoroughly repellent Israel apologists that goes by the name of UK Lawyers for Israel.
I want to
Um,
get to that later on, actually.
okay,
But
so
yeah,
I'll let
before we do, I mean, I guess I just wanted to provide some stats about what's happening in Gaza with regards to the famine and the World Food Programme report. So one of the things they said is that 71,000 children and 17,000 mothers will need urgent treatment for acute malnutrition in the next 2 weeks. So the report came out last week, and so 1 week's nearly gone in the next 2 weeks. So, and to your point about this Kafkaesque scenario where Israeli officials proclaim their desire to impose siege and sanctions and war of annihilation on Gaza, and then when you point out to the evidences, no, no, that's not what's happening. They just deny that, and I think
It's
it takes us to
Hollywood, it's Gazawood,
yes.
it's the 21st century version of Holocaust denial, pure and simple.
Mm. Which takes me to my next point, which is we've spoken about this a number of times, the genocide mania that script Israeli society. So there was an article in the Haaretz last week, which showed how in Israel violence saturates every aspect of society, and it showed chocolate eclairs which are being sold, calling for destruction of Gaza, and the word calling for destruction of Gaza is glazed into the chocolate eclairs, and that's how violence in Israeli society is being celebrated. And the Harrods did an article on that. I was really revealing, and I think we can safely assume that that kind of genocide mania has gripped many pro-Israeli supporters and advocates around the world. And one organization we should mention is what you said, UK Lawyers for Israel. And this group has come under a lot of attack because it it's I think it's executive. He came out and said that there is no famine in Gaza. If anything, um, this famine is good for the Palestinians because it'll help them to lose weight. And he was responding in response to a campaign by a cooperative to boycott Israel. So do you want to kind of give us your thoughts on the UK Lawyers for Israel, what they said, and how this is really another manifestation, example of how genocide mania has gripped so many pro-Israeli advocates, not
Well,
just in Israel, but elsewhere as well?
well, genocide mania is precisely the right term, Nasim. I mean, these chocolate eclairs, I think the story came out right as the new German foreign minister was visiting his favorite colleagues in Israel. Imagine, the foreign minister of a founding member of the International Criminal Court making it a point to travel to Israel and have a warm meeting with an official, Benjamin Netanyahu, who's an international fugitive for justice and wanted by the International Criminal Court, and saying nothing about this. And previously, of course, the new EU foreign policy Supremo, Kate Kallas, I think her name, also, went to bend the knee in front of Netanyahu. I mean, my only question is, did the EU foreign policy chief and the German foreign minister, did they order a few dozen of these genocidal eclairs as gifts for their cabinet colleagues for when they return? Wouldn't surprise me in the least, because I think there's now a consensus, that Europe will stop at nothing to ensure Israeli impunity, particularly when the crime is as severe as genocide. But let's get now to UK lawyers for Israel. I mean, imagine if a Hamas leader came out and said, that our Politburo took a decision, we need to starve our captives because we conducted an assessment and found them to be dangerously overweight, and we should be thanked by the families of these captives for improving their health. Well, that's pretty much precisely what happened. This thoroughly vile, repellent, disgusting, I could use at least 75 more words, snake, Jonathan Turner, actually had the gall to claim that Israel's starvation policy is good for Palestinians. And not only that, he actually thought this was a winning argument. And his colleagues quite clearly agreed with him. That's the type of organization that UK Lawyers for Israel is. Imagine thinking, you know, that it's a good argument to say that starvation is good for its good for its victims. It's really beyond words how deeply entrenched genocide mania has become among people like Turner and his thoroughly repellent organization. And of course, if the shoe was on the other foot, imagine what the response would have been. But now we have to have a serious discussion about whether it is indeed or is not a good thing, instead of across the board criticism, condemnation, ostracization of these vile, repellent, horrible specimens of human beings.
Mm. And UK Lawyers for Israel has become quite notorious in the UK.
Not notorious
Especially,
enough.
especially because of the way it hunts down or goes after individuals who show solidarity towards Palestinians, whether it be schools, universities, hospitals. I know a number of cases where they are actually seeking to stop schools from displaying the Palestinian flag or wearing the keffiyeh, or even wearing the watermelon. So there are campaigns which,
It's the Gestapo in a lawyer's robe, pure and simple.
yeah, I mean, let's move on to a different story. I mean, I don't think it's totally unrelated, which is the um, statement by former EU Foreign Policy Chief Josep Borrell. So he launched into a blistering attack on Israel, accused Israel of committing genocide. Um, and I want to quote exactly what he said. I think it's worth quoting in full, well, some parts of it anyway. So he said, "Seldom have I heard the leader of a state so clearly outline a plan that fits the legal definition of genocide." And then in another section of his speech, he said, "Israel is carrying out the largest ethnic cleansing operation since the end of Second World War in order to create a splendid holiday destination." And then he goes on to say, "We all know what's going on there. We've all heard the objectives stated by Netanyahu's ministers, which are clear declarations and intent for genocide." So this is what he said, and just yesterday, this is a report from the Times in Israel. Just yesterday, Netanyahu, he spoke at a Knesset hearing, and he's reported saying that they are destroying more and more houses, so Palestinians have nowhere to return. The only obvious result, this is Netanyahu saying again, the only obvious result of this devastation will be Gazans choosing to emigrate outside of the Strip. So this again is a clear intent to commit genocide. And as Borrell himself is pointing out, it's coming from the horse's mouth. They are the ones saying that this is what we're planning to do. And if you say this is what they're planning to do, you can be accused of all sorts of things. But going back to Borrell, I mean, what do you make of his statement? And also the fact that he said, EU has more leverage than it's shown. Then why didn't he use it? I mean, he was the, foreign
Exactly.
policy chief for I don't know how many years, 6 or 7 years, I think, 2019 to 2024. So it's 5 years. So what did he do when he was the
Oh,
chief?
exactly. I mean, in Borrell's defense, as many people have pointed out, he was one of the more outspoken EU officials when he was in office. But having said that, are we to believe that he's learned things since he left office that he wasn't aware of when he was in office? Has new information come to the light that suddenly makes him capable of reaching the conclusions and making the observations he does now? Of course not. He could have very easily written the exact same article, word for word, a year ago. And more importantly, had he done so, it might have actually made a difference. Now it's no more than an opinion piece by a retired official, which is not going to have any impact on his former colleagues. In fact, because he was comparatively outspoken when he was in office, his successor is a completely spineless non-entity who thinks the main role of the EU foreign policy chief should be to go and bend the knee to Netanyahu. So yeah, it's he's what he said is right. It's good that he said it, but if he was serious, he would have said this when he could have actually had an impact on the EU policy debate. And unfortunately, he didn't do so. The statements that he did make when he was in office, and some of them were quite strong, never rose to the level that was required. And one can give credit to Borrell for finally coming out with these statements, or as I would say, he knew better. He should have known better. And this article proves that he had an opportunity to make a difference and made a deliberate choice not to.
I wanted to speak also about Nakba Day, the celebration of the commemoration of the Nakba Day, which is just 2 days away from now on the 15th of May, which kind of coincides with Israel's Independence Day, partly because I think with all the discussion about ethnic cleansing and genocide and what we've seen over the past 2 years, I just want to kind of review the underlying foundations of Zionism in Israel itself, partly because I remember an article a month ago by one of Israel's new historian, Tom Segev.
Yes.
He did an interview for Harris where he said that he's come to the conclusion that Zionism was a mistake in his view. And he went on to say that he was brought up on a lie, and he gave several reasons why he thinks that the creation of the State of Israel was a mistake, and that Zionism has failed to provide what it promised, which is security for Jews and the Jewish people. I mean, just my view, and I find these kind of admissions quite interesting. He's not the only one.
Yeah.
So many other people have made similar comments. You could go back over 100 years, 200 years, and actually see people saying, look, Zionism, if you understand the ideology of settler colonialism, you know that it's only heading towards one way, which is years and years and decades of violence and conflict. So if you study the ideology, history of ideologies and how they manifest in reality and the genealogy of such ideologies and how they manifest society, you could have said that over 100 years ago. That's just my view. And I think when people come out with this kind of statements, yes, we should welcome that. But I think, at the same time, we should think, did you not know that this was going to be the case anyway? And October 7 and the 2 years of horrific crimes that we've seen taking place in Palestine is the logical conclusion of an ideology that was the inevitable consequence of an ideology that was seeking Jewish domination in historic Palestine. That's how I view such statements. And I just want to get your thoughts, given that we are approaching Palestine, the Nakba Day, Israel Independence Day. There will be a lot of discussion about Zionism, history of Israel, the catastrophe that befell the Palestinians.
Mm.
So what are your thoughts on
No,
that, given?
I agree with everything you say. I would just make one addition. What I find particularly interesting about Tom Segev, the Israeli historian, is that we're not talking about a lifelong anti-Zionist. Quite the contrary. What we're talking about in this case is a disillusioned Zionist, or at least a disillusioned Israeli. This is not someone who came to this issue from a critical perspective, and whose previous work had been, let's say, in the vein of this interview. But he's one of Israel's most prominent historians. He's written books about everything from the Mandate to Israel's first years and so on. And he has now come to the conclusion, as you said, that the Zionist project is no longer viable, that it's headed towards failure. And most importantly, from his perspective, because he's looking at it from a perspective of what's best for the Jews, that Zionism and the interests of the Jewish people are increasingly contradictory and incompatible. Of course, he's not the first to reach this conclusion, but in his case, I find it particularly interesting because he's come to this view at the advanced age of 80, I believe, is his age now. And there's not much in his career that would lead you to believe, and certainly not much in his previous writings that would lead you to believe that this is a person who's going to come out explicitly against the continuation of the Zionist project.
Yeah, and less explicit in another example is Thomas Friedman. He penned a New York Times article, again demonstrating a crisis of conscience that he's feeling as well. And the title of his article is "This Israeli Government is Not Our Ally." And then he goes on to, this is a message to Trump, I guess, before he travels to the Middle East. And then he goes on to say that your Jewish grandchildren, talking to Trump, will be the first generation of Jewish children who will grow up in a world where the Jewish state is a pariah state. But again, I think this reflects his delusion. I think if he thinks Israel will become a pariah state, is living in cloud cuckoo land. So,
Mm.
just your thoughts on that, I guess, because we want to end on this. Because I think
Yeah.
it's a good time to review where Israel is,
Mm.
and at this moment,
Well,
and
I'm
given the
sorry.
significance. So go on.
Yeah, I'm sorry to have to disappoint you, but I just can't bring myself to take anything that Tom Friedman says or writes seriously. He's making the argument that Israel is going to become a pariah state. Well, Israel was already a pariah state, in the
Exactly.
1970s and 80s. I mean, along with South Africa, these were the two most isolated regimes in the world at that point. And certainly now, at a formal level, Israel has more extensive diplomatic relations than it did then. But if you look at global public opinion, Israel is probably the most detested and reviled entity on the planet. So, yeah, he kind of has another brainwave, and it's just I can't take the man seriously. I'm sorry.
I just because they have been such staunch supporters of Israel for all these decades. Just seeing the collapse of their faith in the Zionist project, which manifests differently with different people. In his case, he still believes it's just Benjamin Netanyahu. Whereas in the case
Yeah.
of Tom Segev, it was no, Zionism itself the
Yes.
project to create a Jewish state in Palestine was a mistake. And
Mm.
but in his case, he seems to think, it's just the Israeli government. It's just Benjamin Netanyahu. He's the reason why Israel
Mm.
will become a pariah state. He's not willing to look deeper in the way Tom Sergey has done and look at the Zionist project
Yeah.
itself and see how this was inevitably going to lead towards the catastrophe that we are seeing unfold in our eyes now, the
No,
genocide of Palestinians.
yeah, that's quite right. And what I would find particularly interesting, getting back to earlier part of our conversation, if U.S.-Israeli relations are indeed headed towards a crisis, and I'm by no means prepared to draw that conclusion today, but if for the sake of argument, such a crisis does exist, it will be, get out the popcorn, because what you'll see is Israel's most fanatic, devoted supporters peel away from it one after the other, and because ultimately their loyalty is to power and position and privilege. And once they sense that Israel is no longer flavor of the month, they'll turn against it in a heartbeat and find the next cause to support. I mean, yes, Israel does have ideological devotees and so on. But as you can see now, for example, on the MAGA right in the Republican Party and among other constituencies that have traditionally, or at least in recent years, been among Israel's strongest supporters in the US, that's beginning to shift. And if people begin to sense that Israel is falling out of favor, they'll abandon it in a heartbeat.
Yeah, I think let's end on this note, Moin. I think we've had a splendid conversation this week.
Mm.
And like always, I look forward to our next week. And thank you, those who have tuned in to watch our show or listen,
Thank you.
however you're listening. I'll see you next week for another conversation with Mouin Rabbani for Palestine This Week. Bye-bye.